All right. If I could have your attention, please. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask about anything pertaining to the course, previous lectures, before I begin my lecture for today? I will be ending lecture just slightly earlier than I usually do. As you know, we go until the very last minute. But we're going to end about 10 minutes early so I can return your papers to you. I'm going to talk to you about the papers very briefly. I also want to say a word about the final exam at this juncture. I mentioned it to you before in class, but I want to do so once again now. Basically what I want to tell you is, number one, that you are responsible for everything in this course from week 1 until week 10, because we haven't had a midterm exam. What we've had is a midterm paper, which is quite different. As I mentioned to you, I think in one of my previous classes, more than half of you actually wrote your paper on one subject, namely the assassination of Gandhi by Godse. So if, for example, there are questions that have to do with development, India as a democracy, obviously that covers, nearly everything that we've done in class from week 1 until, as I said, the last week of this class. All right, so that's the first thing to bear in mind, that you are responsible for everything, including the readings. But I think that, one way to prepare for the exam, if you're thinking about how does one prepare for an exam of this kind, given the nature of the readings and given the material that we have, well, I think that paying attention to what is said in lecture is, I think, exceedingly important, because I'm more than likely to cover the most important points in my lectures. All right. The second thing is to just remind you once again of the format of the exam. So the format of the exam is that it is an essay type exam. So you get 6 questions. It's a take-home open book exam, and you can consult anything that is relevant to the course material. So that includes obviously the lectures, the course readings. You can go to the podcast, they're all available. You can go to external websites, and the same rules apply as they did in for the paper that you did for the midterm, namely that if you're going to use outside sources, you have to mention what the outside sources are. But frankly, to answer the questions that you have in the exam, you do not need any outside sources at all. If you do the readings for the class and you come to the lectures, that's the best way to prepare for the final exam. So you're going to get 6 questions divided into 3 groups. Each group, groups A, B, C, has 2 questions. Group A, 2 questions. You're going to answer both those questions. Group B, you have 2 questions. You answer 1 out of those 2 questions. And group C, again, you have 2 questions, and you answer 1 out of those 2 questions. So you're going to answer 4 out of 6 questions, and roughly each answer is going to be about 2 to 3 pages. So we're talking about, something in the neighborhood of about 10 double-spaced pages typed. Okay, that's essentially the exam. There are no ID questions, there are no maps, nothing of that kind. You just get essay questions. And once again, as I said, if you're attentive to what is said in lecture, I think you'll have a pretty good idea what is important and what isn't important in the scale of things. Everything is important, of course, because we're already condensing huge amounts of material, massive amounts of material, and crystallizing it as a lecture. But within that, there's a scale of things. There obviously, if you get a question about communalism, and I've discussed communalism in this class and mentioned it repeatedly, well, then I think that gives you a little bit of a hint that that's a subject that you should know something about. All right, so that's how you would prepare for the exam, because I know that I'm going to get this question by email, or someone's going to come visit me. Well, how do I prepare for the exam? I'm telling you exactly how you should prepare for the exam. Now, what I propose to do today is to continue my discussion, which will essentially conclude the section that we have on communal conflict, ethnic conflict. One could have mentioned 100 other conflicts, but obviously the idea here is not to give you a list of all the conflicts that have taken place in India post-1947 or in South Asia more broadly, but try to understand by looking at a couple of illustrations. And in my previous lecture, what I did was I looked at the whole dispute over the Babri Masjid. And then I used that dispute, which led to the destruction of the mosque on 6 December 1992, I used that essentially as a way to discuss Hindu-Muslim relations and to look at the nature of the Muslim community in India today and what are some of the liabilities that they face and why is it that the Muslim community as a whole, they're obviously, the Muslim community is not a monolithic community. There are segments of this community that are doing very well. But as a whole, why the Muslim community is relatively more disadvantaged in comparison to, for example, Hindus. Okay? Now, the second illustration, and I started speaking to you about this, is the case of the Sikhs. And this is obviously an enormously complicated history because most of you here know nothing about Sikhism, which is a distinct religion. Well, it is a distinct religion and it isn't, I should say. And in fact, partly the conflict is over that. And when I say it is and it isn't, if you look at the Constitution of India, which is a supreme document, is itself ambivalent in many ways about the Sikhs. And when I say ambivalent, I mean by that in some places of the Constitution, it seems to indicate that Sikhs should be considered to be the followers of a distinct religion. And yet there are other places in the Constitution where it appears to be the case that Sikhs are simply viewed as a sect of Hinduism. And that's true of Buddhists and Jains as well. Right? So it's, in that sense, it's a complicated subject, and I think it's important because it will help you understand what's the nature of this conflict was. And when I say the nature of the conflict, let me remind you once again that in 1984, something I've mentioned in the class before, in 1984, the Prime Minister of India, the then Prime Minister, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, was assassinated by her own bodyguards, two Sikhs. And in order to understand that and what happened in the immediate aftermath of the assassination, there is effectively a pogrom, okay, that is a targeted killing of Sikhs in North India, much of it in the streets of New Delhi, the capital city. And when I say targeted killing, what I'm talking about is Sikhs being dragged out of their homes and being burnt alive, often on the streets. And the state doing absolutely nothing about it. And this lasted for a good 72 hours. Before the Indian government finally steps in, takes action, imposes a curfew, brings in the military, and imposes control over it. And in the course of these 72 hours, roughly, we're talking about 2,000 to 2,500 Sikhs who are going to be killed. And this is, again, the finding of many investigative committees and reports. I mean, there's this fantastic little pamphlet that was published very soon after this happened. It's called Who Are the Guilty? Right? And it's published by PUCL and PUDR. PUCL is a People's Union for Civil Liberties. PUDR is a People's Union for Democratic Rights. These are two NGOs, two non-governmental organizations in India that monitor civil rights and human rights, comparable to what, let's say, Amnesty International does. But these are Indian organizations. And the PUCL report, Who Are the Guilty, is explicit. It even mentions some of the politicians who were implicated in these killings. These politicians were seen giving instructions to people to go and commit arson and murder and loot, so forth and so on. And one of the saddest parts of the story, and I have to tell you that this is the story of India with respect to this question down to the present day, that in most of these orchestrated killings, these orchestrated riots, in the vast majority of them, I shouldn't say most, I should say the vast majority of them, nobody is ever held accountable. Okay? Right? So this is why I think it's important to understand this question. Yes? What motive did they have for the assassination? I'll tell you that story. Yeah, because when we go through this systematically, your question will be answered, I'm certain. All right. So now let's go back now. So I had commenced by telling you that the founder of the religion, Guru Nanak, 15th century figure, 15th, 16th century figure, and the Sikhs have 10 gurus 10 teachers as they're called. So this here, by the way, is a wall print. It's also a poster that you find, and you can find this on the internet as well. So you see the 10 gurus on the top over there, and the shrine that you see here is what is called the Golden Temple. So this is the most sacred shrine of the Sikhs. The language here that you see here, this is Punjabi in Gurmukhi script, right? And then there's a little translation given. And who are the Sikhs? I mean, essentially the Sikhs are a group of people who for about 250 years were trying to create an identity of their own. This religion called Sikhism derives some of its elements from Islam, and it derives some of its elements from Hinduism. Right? That is the easiest way to understand what this religion is. So what does it derive from Islam? It derives, for example, the idea of a monotheistic universe, right? That it's a monotheistic religion. The notion of one God, this is unquestionably derived from Islam, but then there are a great many things that Sikhism actually derives from Hinduism as well, including many of its religious practices. So now, in the early part of the 18th century, and this is the point at which I terminated my previous lecture, I had mentioned to you that the Sikhs had a problem, and the problem was that they were being persecuted by the Muslim rulers of North India. And one of the things you have to remember is that Sikhism is viewed as a competitor to Islam. It's viewed as a competitor because it's a monotheistic faith. And where is Islam drawing most of its adherents from? These are low-caste Hindus who are being converted. You know, very often I get asked a question, many historians do, were they upper-caste Hindus who were being converted as well? The answer is not really. There is not much incentive for someone who's doing well or someone who is positioned at the top of the social ladder to convert to another religion. You might convert for theological reasons, but you certainly would not convert in order to improve your socio-economic prospects. Most people who convert to another religion, and what would you convert to? You would convert to Islam, you would convert to Christianity, right? These are proselytizing faiths. So most people who convert are lower caste Hindus. And that remains the case very much so today. Now, going back to the early part of the 18th century, the 17th century, early part of the 18th century, the Sikhs are being persecuted by the Muslim rulers of North India, and they're partly being persecuted not because Islam is a religion that always persecutes others. One shouldn't arrive at that conclusion. No, they're being persecuted partially because, as I said, they're offering competition to Islam. Okay? So, one of the questions that arises immediately, and it's a question that persists to the present day. That's my interpretation. And that question is, how does a Sikh distinguish himself from everybody else? Now, generally, you can argue that practitioners of different religions can be distinguished very often, not always, by the symbols of the faith. Right? So, for example, if you're an upper caste Hindu, well, many upper caste Hindus go through what is called a thread ceremony. And so, you know, if you look at an upper caste Hindu, very often they'll have underneath their shirt, they'll have a thread, which is part of the thread ceremony. You can distinguish a Muslim from a Hindu very often because they're wearing a skull cap. More likely to have a beard, for example. But again, these are not hard and fast ways to distinguish it. What about a Muslim who decides that he's not going to, you know, carry the external symbols of his appearance about him? Right? And in 1947, at the time of partition, I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but in 1947, at the time of partition, when people were crossing borders, and all of you now understand the chaos that reigned at that time, you arrive at a border and a mob catches you. How are they going to decide whether they're going to kill you or not? Right? So a Hindu mob catches a Muslim. How do they know that the person is a Muslim? Well, you can't really tell if the person is not showing visible signs. So there was only one way to tell. And that was you asked the male person to lower his pants, and if he was circumcised or if he wasn't, you could tell whether the person was a Muslim or a Hindu. And there are a great many incidents where we know that this is exactly what happened. But of course, in normal everyday life, you just don't go around asking people to lower their pants, right? In order to distinguish whether a person is a Muslim or a Sikh or a Hindu or whatever. Now, one of the things that Guru Gobind Singh is going to do, he's the last guru, is he's going to try to consolidate the faith because he's worried. Why is he worried? Because there's a constant tendency on the part of the Sikh to go back into the Hinduism from which he came out. Why? In part because there's a safety of numbers. That the Hindus constitute the vast majority, you're being persecuted, you relapse back into the faith from which you came. This question of who is a Sikh is a very pertinent question because, of course, what one would want to say is that what distinguishes a Sikh from a Muslim or a Hindu or a Christian are the theological doctrines that the Sikh adheres to. But the problem, as always in India, is that there is a tendency for these faiths to be absorbed into Hinduism. So even Muslims in South Asia, many Muslims themselves, by the way, living here who are from South Asia, are completely unaware of it. But virtually all South Asian Muslims actually are members of caste communities. And the idea of caste is in principle completely abhorrent to Islam because this is a specifically Hindu institution, as I pointed out on numerous occasions in this class. Right? And caste introduces a form of hierarchy. The second half of this lecture will be on caste when we'll start looking at Dalits. But you recall my discussion about caste in a previous lecture. And what I'm suggesting to you here is that this is always a problem that a Sikh collapses back into being a Hindu. So what Guru Gobind Singh is going to do is he's going to say, I'm going to create the grounds for considering the Sikhs to be a completely different people. And one of the ways in which they are going to be distinguished is that when you join an order, so if you're a Hindu and you join, for example, a monastic order, what do? You have your head shaved and you're given a new name. You're given a new name, right? It's like a baptism. The Sikh does exactly the opposite. Exactly the opposite means you cannot cut your hair. You cannot cut your hair at all. Okay, and so this is one of the 5 symbols of the faith. It's called kesh. You can read about it in various places. K-E-S. Kesh means long hair. That the Sikh male is not supposed to shorn his hair at all. This is one of the ways in which you distinguish the Sikh male from everyone else. Okay, so this is the situation that we're, and so this is what is called the Khalsa. Let me go back to the slide over here. So if you look at the second, Guru Nanak, Guru Gobind Singh and the Khalsa. So the Khalsa is the brotherhood of the pure. This is the institutionalization of Sikhism. And particularly what is going to now become the more orthodox form of Sikhism. Because what happens when a Sikh decides that he's not going to keep his hair long? Right, so in 1984, when Mrs. Gandhi was assassinated and Sikhs were being dragged out of their homes, you know what many Sikh males did? They cut their hair immediately. Because if you cut your hair, how would you be distinguished from a Hindu? That was one way to save your life. Now, if you cut your hair, do you cease being a Sikh? And if you said yes, well, then that's a very shallow understanding of the faith, because then we're saying that the only thing that makes a Sikh is the external symbols that he or she carries around him. But are there no real theological differences or philosophical differences between being a Sikh and being a Muslim and being a Hindu? Right? So I hope you're beginning to see what the problem here is. Now, and this, when I say roots of Sikh separatism, this is exactly the problem in the 19th century. There was frankly very few ways other than the external symbols by which you could distinguish a Sikh from a Hindu. And the common tendency was to celebrate your festivals together. In the Punjab, it was very common, exceedingly common. In fact, common all the way until the 1970s for a family which had 2 or more children to bring one up as a Hindu, the other as a Sikh, in the same family. It was exceedingly common. Okay, partially because I'm suggesting to you that the common way in which the Sikhs lived was in fact to share a lifestyle, for the most part, with the Hindus. But the impulse, on the other hand, is to constantly distinguish yourself from them. Right? And this is what I mean by roots of Sikh separatism and differentiation from Hindus. So now if you look at the census in 1855, in 1855 and 1881 census enumerations, the Sikhs are classified differently. In 1855, the census says that the Sikhs are just Hindus. The 1881 census says, well, they're not really Hindus, but it doesn't say who they are. It doesn't say how the Sikhs are to be defined. Okay, so you keep on getting this ambivalence. And if you look at their history, then moving into the 20th century, one of the things that the Sikhs are going to be overwhelmingly represented in is the Indian Army. The reason for that is that in 1857, 1858, when the rebellion, the Great Rebellion took place in 1857-58, this was the most considerable threat to British rule up till this point in time. In the aftermath of the rebellion, which the British crushed, the British decided to divide all Indians into martial races and non-martial races. And we're not going to get into the intricacies of how they did that, or whether this is a lunatic way of trying to classify people, whether you have martial qualities, whether you're warlike or whether you're not. The Sikhs, in any case, were viewed as a martial race. That is, that they were viewed as people who were more masculine, who were much more likely to make for good and loyal soldiers. And one consequence of that was that the Sikhs would become overwhelmingly represented in the Indian Army. So even though their share of the population of India was less than 3%, there have been times when the Sikhs constituted over 20% of the Indian Army. Over 20%. Okay, and so this is going into their history now in the early part of the 20th century and moving into the latter half of the 20th century. Now in 1947, of course, when partition took place, there were Sikhs who demanded that there should be a separate nation state for them as well. If in other words, a separate nation state was going to be created for the Muslims, known to the nation state that gets to be known as Pakistan, why should a separate nation state not be created for the Sikhs? But this demand was not conceded. Neither the Muslims nor the Hindus conceded the demand, and the Sikhs' numbers were not sufficiently large. And of course, within the Sikh community itself, there were people who were divided on this demand. Right? So it didn't really have the support of the vast majority of the Sikhs, partially because, as I said to you, and as I've mentioned repeatedly, the Sikhs themselves did not always distinguish themselves from the Hindus. Yes, they're distinct in some ways, and then there are many ways in which they're really not quite distinct. Now, moving into the 1970s, 1980s, and to the assassination of Mrs. Gandhi, the first thing to bear in mind is that the Punjab, which is the historic homeland of the Sikhs, that is, the Sikhs tended to be concentrated there, which is not to say that they're not to be found in other parts of India. They're exceedingly diasporic people. And for those of you who come from Canada or who have some familiarity, even a remote familiarity with the west coast of Canada, with Vancouver, with British Columbia, you know that there's a very substantial Sikh population in British Columbia, Vancouver, which goes back to about 125 years. Okay, and there's a fairly substantial Sikh population in the greater Los Angeles area as well. Now, one of the things that happened in the Punjab in the 1960s was what is called the Green Revolution. Okay, and we need to spend just a minute or two on the Green Revolution, because one of the things that the Green Revolution did was it enormously helped increase food production in India. You also have, by the way, what is sometimes in the literature called a white revolution, which refers to a considerable increase in milk production in India, but that's separate from the Green Revolution. Okay, and that takes place, the White Revolution as it's called, takes place largely in the state of Maharashtra in Western India. The Green Revolution was something that is going to be found in most parts of India where you have agricultural communities, but the part of India where its effects were most palpable, because it was in some ways the granary of India, the breadbasket. The way in which, for example, California is in many ways the agricultural heart of the United States. right? That California produces, for example, more than 50% of the walnuts and almonds. I mean, almost anything that you can think of, right? California is the largest producer by far. Now, the Punjab was the granary. And this is where the Green Revolution, and what does the Green Revolution do? So what the Green Revolution does, I'm giving you the rosy picture here. There's a very critical assessment of the Green Revolution. But let's look at the rosy picture first. The rosy picture is it helps increase food production tremendously. How does it do it? It introduces, for example, new kinds of seeds. Okay? The Green Revolution is reliant upon more mechanized farming. And when I say more mechanized farming, that in order to have a considerable increase in food production, what you have to do is you have to consolidate very small properties and make these farms larger. Because, for example, if you're going to use tractors, you cannot really use a tractor effectively if the total area that you have is, let's say, 1/4 of an acre, which is almost nothing. But if you combine 50 farms that were 1/4 of an acre, 1 acre, 2 acres, 5 acres, you combine them all together, you can obviously, from this point of view, you can then introduce mechanized farming. So you introduce tractors, you've got new seeds, you've got hybrid seeds, okay, and of course you improve the sources of water, because most agriculture is going to be either be rain-fed or it's going to be irrigation-fed, okay, through a system of canals, for example. And there is no question that food production went up in India. And now India, in principle, over the course of the last decade, has had a surplus of food. I say in principle, of course, because if 50% of the population of India is suffering from malnutrition, it's very clearly the case that everybody is not getting the amount of food that they should be getting to eat. But India can still claim that they have a surplus food production, because what this means is that those who are able to buy the food in whatever quantities they want are able to do so. And then there are people who don't have access to food. And then if you're surplus, it means that you're actually exporting some of your grains. Okay, so food production in India, and I'm not going to give you statistics because you can find that from any source, went up tremendously over the course of the last 3 to 4 decades. The critical view of the Green Revolution, and we'll go back to the Punjab in just a moment, but I'm just giving you the economic picture of the Green Revolution. The critical view of the Green Revolution, and there are a great many critics who have stepped forward in recent years, is that what it did was it depleted the soil dramatically. It put enormous pressure on the soil. And that the mass scale use of irrigation, for example, created bodies of water, many of which were stagnant and then became breeding grounds for mosquitoes, for example. Okay? So there are people who have argued that in the short term the Green Revolution may have been productive for India, but in the long run it is actually detrimental to Indian agriculture. And we're not going to now try to resolve that question. We're going to try to relate it to the Punjab. What it did in the Punjab was it helped to consolidate land holdings. And as a consequence, many smaller farmers were driven out of the business. They could no longer earn their livelihood. To some extent, the unhappiness and dissatisfaction in the Punjab is going to be determined by the Green Revolution. That the consequences of the Green Revolution were it created a new rich class of landlords. And it led to the pauperization of a substantial number of Punjabi farmers, some of whom are now going to become part of that insurrection. So when I say insurrection, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is the demand for a separate Sikh state, which is going to be called Khalistan. And one of the persons who is the proponent of Khalistan, in fact, he is the most well-known proponent of Khalistan, his name is Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale. So who is Jarnail Bhindranwale? He's an itinerant preacher in the 1970s. Right? And he's an Orthodox Sikh, so he says, for example, that all Sikh males should keep their hair long, they should all carry a kirpan. A kirpan is one of the other symbols of the faith. Right? So remember I told you that there are these 5 symbols of the faith. All of these 5 words begin with a K, so very often they're called the 5 Ks. We don't have to know all of them, but a kirpan is basically a, well, the minute you translate it, you render it into a slightly different object, but you can think of it as a sword or as a dagger. So if you go, for example, to Amritsar, that place where the Golden Temple is, you saw an image of the Golden Temple, you'll very often see Sikhs walking around, and they're legally entitled to do that. Right? So they're walking around with this huge dagger. The sword could be like a Japanese sword almost. It could also be a very small dagger, a very, very small dagger. And Orthodox Sikhs, the Khalsa Sikhs, in other words, are required to have the dagger on their body 24 hours a day. Now, there's an extraordinary case that came up in California about 20, 25 years ago. Just to give you a little illustration of how this works. So there's a Sikh family living, in central California called the Chima family. They had 2 children. And these children were going to Sikh. They were Khalsa Sikhs. And both of them had this little dagger, a little penknife almost. Okay, it's sewed into their clothes. Right? So it's on them all the time. And one of these boys was playing basketball, and when he was shooting, hoops, some other kid saw him, white kid saw this little, dagger or knife, and went to the school principal and said, well, there's this kid who's going around with a little knife or little dagger, little sword. And so the principal summoned the boy and his sister and said, well, you're violating the school code, and you're violating California regulations because you cannot carry a weapon to school. And so the children, of course, said, well, this is not a weapon. This is a kirpan. And the principal said, of course, I don't care what you call it. A dagger looks like a dagger to me, or a sword looks like a sword to me. Right? And so he said, well, you're forbidden to come to school unless you decide that you're not going to bring these. So the kids' parents come to school the following day and say that, well, our kids have to come to school with this object. And the principal said, well, I can't allow it. And so the children's parents, of course, said, well, the kirpan means exactly to a Sikh what a cross means to a Christian. So if a Christian can come with a little necklace with a cross, why can a Sikh not come with a little kirpan? And of course, the principal's rejoinder was, yeah, but a kirpan could be used to actually attack another child. And so the Sikh family said, well, has there ever been an instance of this in the history of California? Anyhow, it went to the courts, by the way. It went to the courts. The American Union for Civil Liberties was drawn into the conflict. Extraordinary case, okay, of civil liberties, so forth and so on. So that's what we're talking about. That's the kirpan. Right? Now, Bhindranwale, he says all Sikh males should carry the symbols of their faith. And one of the things that's going to begin to happen in the 1970s is that those Sikhs who have abandoned the symbols of the faith, that doesn't mean they've abandoned their religion from their point of view. It's simply that they've decided that, hey, well, I don't want to be going around seen with a kirpan, nor do I want long hair and a long beard. Right? And of course, those who were living in the United States said, well, I can't really be working on Wall Street with this kind of beard, for example. Right? So many of them just said, we're going to sever the symbols from the religious content of the faith. And Bhindranwale said, well, no. Once you do that, you've left the faith effectively. So this is now going to become a conflict within the faith. Of course, the demand for Khalistan has many other aspects to it. And it has, for example, a linguistic demand that Punjabi should be recognized and be given the same status as Hindi or Bengali or whatever, that Chandigarh, which was the joint capital of 2 Indian states, Punjab and another state called Haryana, that in fact it should be the capital only of the Punjab. Okay, so one of the demands, one of the more unusual demands, for example, that the advocates of Khalistan raised was that all Sikhs should be allowed to board Air India flights. They knew that this demand would not work vis-a-vis British Airways or United Airways or American Airlines. But, Air India and Indian Airlines, these are domestic these are Indian carriers. They said all Sikhs should be allowed to carry a kirpan on board. And of course, no nation state is going to permit, its citizens to go and carry arms on board. And of course, their claim was, oh, these are not arms. Well, if you've got a sword that's 5 feet in length, what is it? right? And there's an interesting set of questions to be raised about it. But I'm just indicating to you that there were a great many demands that were put forward by the advocates of Khalistan, including Bhindranwale, and the Indian state, of course, is going to refuse to accept most of these demands. So in the 1970s, you're essentially going to have an insurrection, an insurgency, because the Sikhs are going to claim that they're being discriminated against in India. But remember the argument that I've given to you, that it's not simply a fight against the Indian state. It's a fight within the religion between the Khalsa Sikhs, that is the Orthodox Sikhs, and the so-called moderate Sikhs, who have decided that the external symbols of the faith can be abandoned, and you do not in any way, therefore, jeopardize your status within the religion. And this is not a view that is shared by the Khalsa Sikhs or the Orthodox Sikhs. And so beginning in the 1970s, mid to late 1970s, what you're going to have is basically a civil war. In the Punjab and in neighboring areas, there are going to be bomb explosions in Delhi, for example, frequent bomb explosions on buses, right? And this is going to continue to accelerate this trend. In the 1980s, Bhindranwale is going to hole up inside the Golden Temple. So this is going to become extremely controversial. So this is the Golden Temple, by the way. So this is the most sacred shrine of the Sikh faith in a city called Amritsar in North India, only 15 miles from the border with Pakistan, right? And this is, as you've already seen this, and this here is a photograph of what they found inside the Golden Temple. So in 1984, Bhindranwale and a large number of militant Sikhs, they are going to basically be holed up inside the temple. They're going to conduct these attacks, guerrilla attacks, if you want to call them that. So you go conduct an attack outside, you kill a moderate Sikh, or you kill a Hindu who you think is your antagonist, and then you go and take shelter inside the Golden Temple. Of course, the advantage of taking shelter inside the Golden Temple is it's a sacred shrine. They're quite certain that the Indian government will not dare to enter into this shrine and defile it. But in fact, that is exactly what the Indian government is going to do. So in June of 1984, we are going to have what is called Operation Blue Star, where the Indian army is going to move into the Golden Temple. You're going to have a gun battle that takes place. And once this gun battle is over, Bhindranwale is killed. A lot of the militants are, quote, flushed out, as the Indian government put it. Right? They're going to find that there is a huge military arsenal inside the Golden Temple. Right? Grenades, ammunition, rifles, bullets, so forth and so on. And what you see here is one of the photographs that was published once the Indian government had gone inside it. This is the desecration of the shrine, the Golden Temple. And you compare it with the picture that you saw before. Of course, now it's been completely restored again. So there was a question, why was Mrs. Gandhi assassinated? Okay? And the reason she is assassinated in part is because she was the Indian Prime Minister who issued the orders for the attack upon Bhindranwale and the Sikh militants inside the Golden Temple. But in order to weed them out and to destroy them, the Indian government eventually ended up desecrating the shrine, destroying it in great measure. Right? And this was, of course, considered the desecration of the faith, the defilement of the faith. And in the aftermath of this, Mrs. Gandhi was told by her security advisors, you should not have Sikh bodyguards, right? Because the Sikhs are very angry at what you've done. And it's an interesting way to understand Indian democracy here now. Because Indira Gandhi certainly had authoritarian tendencies in her. There's no question about that. Right? So, for example, in 1975, I mean, this is a chapter of our history that we haven't really looked at for obvious reasons because we can't cover everything. But in 1975, Mrs. Indira Gandhi imposed a state of emergency. This was the first and only time a state of emergency was ever imposed in India. And when she imposed a state of emergency, what did it mean? It meant that all the constitutional safeguards that you, as an ordinary citizen, had, all of these were suspended. The grounds for imposing the emergency were that there were internal and external threats to the unity and integrity of India. And that India had to be safeguarded from its internal and external enemies. So this is what I mean when I say she had authoritarian tendencies. On the other hand, it's extraordinary that even though she issued the orders for the attack on the Golden Temple and therefore incurred the wrath of the Sikhs, she still kept Sikh bodyguards because she said, we're living in a secular country. And I cannot cast doubt on every Sikh merely because they happen to be a Sikh and merely because the Sikhs as a whole, as a community, might feel unhappy with me. These people are my bodyguards. I trust them. They have been entrusted to guard my life. And both of these bodyguards are going to turn on her. They're going to machine gun her down. And it's immediately in the aftermath of that that you're going to have this pogrom that takes place against the Sikhs. Okay? So this is what we're really talking about here. And I think in order to understand this conflict, let me just summarize it very, very quickly. Some of the things that you need to think about. That I'm suggesting to you that most people will view it simply as a conflict between Sikhism and Hinduism, or as a conflict between the Sikhs and the Indian state. And there is no question that there are elements of that, right? There are elements of that in this. But I'm also suggesting to you that the root of the problem in many ways goes back to the question of who is a Sikh? What distinguishes a Sikh from a Hindu? If the Sikh is constantly relapsing back into a state of Hinduism, what is the role of the external symbols of the faith? If this is all that safeguards your identity as a Sikh, then we're saying that, well, frankly, that faith is not substantially different from Hinduism. And what happens when you abandon the symbols of the faith completely? Right? You cut your hair. They're called Mona Sikhs, the people who cut their hair. You don't have any beard. You don't wear a turban. You don't carry the kirpan with you. Do you cease to be a Sikh then? This question remains somewhat unresolved in India down to the present day. Right? So a conflict that appears to be simply a conflict between the Sikhs and the Indian state, or appears to be, as some people were likely to argue, a conflict between Hindus and Sikhs, perhaps is much more complex than that. Okay, so this is one reason among many why I think that it's important to understand the nature of this conflict, because it also gives you some idea of what are the ways in which different religions negotiate their identity and their future in India. And I want to just end with this particular slide, this segment of the lecture, before I move on to the next section. So this is, by the way, it just, there are hundreds of such slides. So Khalistan, the new global reality, and this slide is actually quite amusing because there's a website, flags including the flag of Khalistan. So you want to create your own nation state, what do? You create your own flag, your own anthem, national bird, national animal, right? Khalistan's national bird, the hawk, not a pigeon. You're after all a martial race, right? So you want to have a hawk, not a sparrow. Right? And then, of course, to make it look very authentic, well, that this is a real state. It's not a real state. I mean, don't think that if you're issued a passport by the government of Khalistan that you can walk into the United States or Russia or China or India, because they'll throw you out. It's not a passport that's recognized by anybody, of course. But this is the aspiration of all people. You want to become a nation state. It's the logic of the nation state, right? So this is one of these sites that represents the Khalistani point of view. And I have to say, in my concluding remark, that the last holdouts of the Khalistan ideal are all to be found in the state of California. I mean, California has now the largest number of supporters of Khalistan anywhere in the world. This is, again, a rather common phenomenon. It's like, if you're a Zionist, well, the great Zionists are always going to be found in the United States, not in the state of Israel. Not that Israel doesn't have any. They have some too. But they're going to be found here in the U.S. Right? Because this diasporic, transnational context is always crucial for understanding these communities and their political aspirations. Any questions? Because, as I said, this wraps up our discussion of the whole question of communal conflict, all of that. And I should say one more thing. I'll take a question in just a second. One last comment. I want to reinforce this point because I mentioned it to you before. Religious conflict, communal conflict. We use these phrases interchangeably. They're not exactly the same for reasons that I'd mentioned to you before. I want to reinforce that point. That throughout India's long history, we have reason to believe that people quarreled as they do today all over the world on many grounds. You might have a conflict with a person on many grounds. Right? Those grounds could be sexual, linguistic, economic, any number of grounds. And there's no reason to believe that someone called a Hindu and someone called a Hindu did not enter into conflict at some point or the other. There might have been reasons why people disagreed. Religion being one of the grounds on which people do disagree. But it's not the same as communal conflict, because in the 19th century, under colonial rule, the standard explanation for everything that the colonial state had was, Hindus and Muslims are two distinct communities and their destiny is to fight each other. That's a communal conflict. Okay? That when it becomes an automatic template, it becomes the de facto explanation for everything. Right? And that's why I gave you this little illustration that supposing you read a little article. I remember reading these articles so frequently in the Indian newspapers back in the 60s and 70s. You know, Hindu landlord and Muslim landless laborer have a conflict. Well, why should we assume that this is only a religious conflict? Right? Why should we not assume that this is a class conflict? So this communal conflict is a template whereby religion becomes the central element of understanding Indian history. And what I'm doing is I'm issuing you a cautionary note that we have to be extremely suspicious of all interpretations which immediately use the model of communalism to explain the nature of conflicts in India. Yes, question there, Dominic, I think.
Yeah, what's that UNPO?
Oh, that's a United Nations postal organization. That's what it is. Yeah. Yeah.
How did you mentioned the story between the family and who carried the Kirpan? How did that?
Oh, it's a long story. I published a 35-page article on that. So if you've got the interest and the time, I can give you a citation to that later on. Okay, but it's a long story. But the gist of it is that the state of California actually passed a legislation that made an exception to the legislation. The governor of California, Pete Wilson, at that time vetoed that legislation. Okay, that's part of the story. But the saga, not of that family, this particular question continues down to the present day. Okay? Now, what I want to do is I want to turn your attention to the question of the Dalits. And you have, for this week, in part, this reading. I had mentioned to you that for those of you who picked up the book, so it's got 4 modules or sections, and I said read any 2 of your choice. I hope that some of you will read the whole book, maybe not now because I'm sure you've got other classes and other compelling things to do, but at some point, because I think that these are short selections and I think they've been very carefully chosen. And some of the pieces are actually quite gripping, I think. But I want to say a few things. I'm not going to be able to conclude my discussion of the Dalits today for obvious reasons. But I want to, before I get into the question of the Dalits, so and who are the Dalits? The Dalits are the people who are at the lowest rung of Indian society. Right? And you might recall my discussion of caste a couple of weeks ago. I pointed out to you there's this textbook view, there are these 4 castes, and then there is the ground view. And that the ground view and the textbook view may not be the same. The illustration I'd given was that the textbook view might say that, well, a Brahmin should keep a distance of 50 feet or 100 feet from a Shudra, because otherwise he'll get contaminated. But the ground view, of course, is that if you're living in, for example, an urban setting in India, right, and you're traveling on a bus together or a train, well, you know, and the person next to you might be a Brahmin, you might be upper caste, and you might be surrounded by lower caste people, by Dalits, by Shudras, all the time. Right? So there's obviously a difference between the ground view and the textbook view. There may be instances where it coincides. So, for example, many people would argue that one of the places where the ground view, that is what actually happens on the ground, and what the textbooks say, one of the places where they coincide is, for example, the taboo on inter-caste marriage. Right? That what is the degree to which inter-caste marriages take place in India? Do they take place at all? Some people have argued, for those of you who keep an interest in Bollywood, there's this actor called Saif Ali Khan, a well-known Indian Muslim actor in Bollywood, one of the reigning stars of Bollywood, and about 15 days ago he wrote an op-ed piece for an Indian newspaper, was circulated widely, where he says that we have to follow what Ambedkar said, because Ambedkar said that the only solution to the problem of caste is inter-caste marriages. I am not, by the way, fully persuaded of that argument myself. Right? Just as I'm not fully persuaded that the only way, or that the best way to ensure good racial relations between black people and white people are interracial marriages. There may be contexts in which that may be true, and there may be contexts in which it's not true. I'll give you an illustration, nothing to do with India, but just so long as you understand the nature of the problem. I'll give you an illustration from a country that I've studied at considerable length, and that is Rwanda in Africa. Right? So at Rwanda, as some of you might know, in 1994 there was a genocide which killed 800,000 people in 3 months. So in Rwanda, you have two dominant groups of people, the Tutsis and the Hutus. Okay? There's a third group of people, they're minuscule in number, they're called the Swa. We don't need to worry about them. So in 1984, to cut a long story short, when this genocide took place in the spring of 1994, the Hutus, who are numerically much greater in number than the Tutsis, committed a genocide and killed about 800,000 Tutsis. Now, there are a number of very interesting things about this, but I only want to mention the one that is pertinent to my argument here. And that is that there was a very high rate of intermarriage between the Tutsis and the Hutus. Unlike in India, where there is an extremely low rate of intermarriage between Hindus and Muslims, and between the upper caste Hindus and lower caste Hindus. Okay? Extremely low rates. Particularly inter-religious marriages, but even inter-caste marriages, the rates are very low, and when these marriages do take place, as I pointed out in a previous lecture, the likelihood is it will be an upper caste male marrying a lower caste female, because their children, the children of that marriage, will acquire the status of their father. Okay? So that's why you are going to find very few instances of upper caste women who are going to marry downwards. Just as you're going to find very few instances of highly educated women in this society who are going to marry downwards. Very few. Most of them are going to marry men who are going to have at least the same educational status as they do. And then, of course, you get into the problem of what happens to the marriage pool. Okay? Because if they're highly educated men who are going to marry women who are not that well educated, right? So you have to look at those contexts as well. That what happens to a marriage pool when you have certain kinds of marriage situations. We'll get into that later on when we look at what is called endogamy. But this illustration is important only because I'm suggesting to you that the fact that there were a great many Tutsis who were married to Hutus, this did not save the Tutsis from being massacred when the genocide took place in 1994. Okay? But this is not an argument against inter-caste or inter-religious marriages. I want you to be very clear that I'm not arguing for anything like that. I'm simply suggesting that I'm not completely persuaded that inter-caste marriage is the only way or the best way necessarily of trying to resolve what are going to be caste conflicts. Okay? So, in 1947, now let's go back to independence. In 1947, at the time of partition, and in the immediate aftermath of that, as you all know, the Constitution is drafted. And the Constitution stipulates that there will be reservations. Reservations. So reservations means that a certain percentage of seats in educational institutions, in government jobs, will be reserved, will be set aside for disadvantaged people. And who are the disadvantaged people? So the disadvantaged people are initially listed as SCs, that's scheduled caste. I explained that in a previous lecture, so I'm not going to go over it again. STs, which means scheduled tribes. Okay? And the people who are called the Harijans, which is Gandhi's name for the untouchables. Right? And who are the untouchables? Complicated matter. Because the old Indian texts do not mention a fifth group of people. So they mention, of course, the Brahmins. You remember let me just write down these words quickly. Brahmins, who are the priestly caste, then you've got the Kshatriyas, the high-level administrators, warriors, all of that. Vaishyas, traders, shopkeepers, entrepreneurs, and then the Shudras. Okay, sometimes with a H over here, Shudras. The untouchables, or Harijans, children of God, as Gandhi started calling them in the 1920s. Post-1947, they're officially known as the scheduled castes because they're mentioned in an appendix or scheduled to the Constitution. The same group of people here that we're talking about. Okay, and now known by the name of Dalits. Okay, they are not mentioned in this textbook view that we have of caste. So how did this fifth caste arise? Well, there are lots of theories about that. We won't be detained by those theories because then we'll have to really get into the whole history of caste and so forth and so on. But some of the theories have to do with that the Shudras themselves started to fragment and splinter, and those who were worse off became the fifth caste. There are some theories about the fifth caste being people who were the children of illegitimate marriages, so forth and so on. Okay, but at some point, a further fragmentation takes place. And then you get, as I said, the fifth, also called the Panchama, which is the fifth group or the fifth caste, and now known as the Dalits. So in 1947-50, when the Constitution is being written, and the person who is the chairman of the drafting committee, his name is B.R. Ambedkar, himself a member of the Dalit community. He's a Mahar. Mahar is a caste community from Maharashtra. Okay? And I think it's interesting that the job of drafting the Constitution is entrusted to a Dalit. He's not the only one. He's a chairman of the drafting committee. There are others who help him draft the Constitution, but there's no question that his imprint on the Constitution is visible. Right? So 1947-50, reservations are officially put into the system. That a certain percentage of seats are going to be reserved. And they're going to be reserved because these people who are the beneficiaries of these reservations belong to historically disadvantaged communities. And there must be some way in which they can now be raised in that society so that they can become equal citizens. And Ambedkar himself was optimistic enough to believe that these reservations would only be necessary for 10 years. All right? Only for 10 years. And subsequently he changed his mind because when the period was drawing to a close, he saw, of course, that it had done nothing really effectively to resolve the issue. Because we're not talking about a handful of people here. We're talking about tens of millions of people who are going to be impacted by, this reservation policy. That towards the end, he says, we're going to need it for another 30 years. We're going to need reservations for another 30 years. All right? And I think there is no one in India, unless, of course, a person is in principle opposed to reservation, just as there are people who in principle are opposed to affirmative action in the United States. So unless you are, for ideological reasons, completely opposed to that idea altogether, but if you're not opposed to it, there is no one who thinks that we're going to be able to resolve the question of caste inequality by reservations or by eliminating reservations in the next 20, 25 years. There's no one who has such an optimistic assessment today. And when I say historically disadvantaged, I mean by that, of course, that these are people who belong to communities that have been disadvantaged for centuries. And when I say disadvantaged, what do I mean? That they have no access to education, they have no access to, and of course somebody could say, well, who had access to education in 1800? So, right, in 1800, the idea that there would be mass education was completely unknown. In India, and indeed in almost every other society. But of course one could give hundreds of other illustrations, because disadvantage means, for example, that the Dalit would have to announce his presence if he came within a certain distance of an upper caste Hindu, especially in a pilgrimage town. That the Dalit could not enter the Hindu temple. He might be skinned alive if he tried to enter a Hindu temple. That the Dalit could not draw water from the village well. If the village had only one well, one source of water, or a tank, okay, so if you look at the Hindu temple, especially in the South Indian city, that next to the temple is usually a large tank. That's a body of water. Right? But the Dalit could not access that water. And so the Dalit, and usually it meant Dalit women, by the way, because Dalit women are the ones who are going to be walking 10 miles away to fetch a pot of water or to fetch firewood, right, in order to be able to light their stove at night to cook. That Dalit woman might have to walk 10 miles to be able to access water. Now, the Constitution of India forbid the practice of untouchability. But of course, this is, simply because a legislation says that, untouchability is henceforth banished, that doesn't mean that the practice of untouchability disappears. Right? Not even remotely. I mean, in the aftermath of the Civil War, African Americans technically were American citizens. But that doesn't mean that you automatically get all the rights of citizenship simply because a portion of the American Constitution says, well, they're citizens. We know what happened if an African American would try and go vote. You'd get lynched. And that's why you had to pass the Voting Rights Act in 1965. All right? One way to look at the situation, some people would argue, is to look at comparable examples. I'm not certain in my mind that there are any comparable examples entirely, because I think that the nature of the problem here is much deeper. I think it's much more widespread, and it's a systematic problem for Indian society. So the comparison that many people very often made was with apartheid in South Africa. Okay, the system of apartheid. Quick question. You'll have to speak up. I can't really hear you. How come Dalits don't convert to what? Islam, Christianity. Well, some of them do. Where did Islam get its ranks of people from? But this is the problem. The answer to your question, so this is why if you go to that reading, it's very important. Okay? That a person converts. Let's say you're in a village. I'm glad you asked the question because we can get to the heart of the matter right away. Let's say you're living in a village and you're a Dalit and you convert. Right? You become a Muslim or you become a Christian. The problem is that everybody still knows who you are. And even if, by the way, you were a Dalit millionaire, somebody might say, isn't that an oxymoron? No, it's not. There are Dalit billionaires in India. And I'm talking about Dalit dollar billionaires. I'm not talking about rupee billionaires, which is a much lower thing because there's 60 rupees to a dollar. There are Dalits who are dollar billionaires. But if that person who was a dollar billionaire tried to marry a Hindu upper caste woman, there might still be problems. Because people still know who you are. And one of the reasons why the Dalits flee to the city, okay, why they like to go to the city, is because a city allows you to be anonymous. A lot of the Hindi films, You know, many of you who watch Bollywood, I know that, the South Asians. You look at the films and see the role of the city. The city allows you to escape your history very often. Okay? The city allows you to escape your history, so the Dalits believe that movement to urban areas is one solution. Because when you go to a city with 20 million people, who knows who you are? What's your history? In a village, everyone knows your history. So they have found very often that Dalits who convert to Christianity, you know what happens? That when they go to the local village church, if there is a village church, many of the villages won't have a church, but let's say in those parts of India where Christianity is found. South India, for example, and Tamil Nadu and Kerala, very good example, there are going to be a lot of churches because there's a substantial Christian population. So what happens when a Dalit converts to Christianity? When they go to the church, they are asked to sit at the back of the church, always. You cannot escape your history. Okay? So you could convert and think that Christianity and Islam are more hospitable, that they're more egalitarian religions. And I don't want to enter into the debate of whether they are or are not, because that's a long subject. Complicated subject, obviously. Right? But we do know, of course, that there is enormous class inequality, for example, in Muslim societies. Even in the Hajj, you know, you read studies of the Hajj, how the Saudis are treated when they do the Hajj, and how a Nigerian Muslim is treated. It's two different worlds completely. Completely two different worlds. Okay, so that's the short answer to the question. So what I want to suggest, therefore, is this, that when you go back to the 47-50 period, we're talking about, okay, reservations is one way in which and I've described to you what are the disadvantages that a person suffers from. And I'm suggested to you that this question of reservations carries on into present day discussions. Now I'm going to have to stop my lecture on the Dalits for today, because I want to return the papers to you. I want to take a few minutes to return the papers to you and talk to you about the papers, but we will pick it up from there, and I do want you to read at least 2 of those 4 sections in the book. So I also want to introduce Maria Ornelas. So Maria has done a good deal of the grading as well for the papers, the grading of the papers. And as I mentioned to you in my previous class, in one of my previous lectures, that there will usually be an initial next to your grade, and if it's VL, it's obviously my initials, and if it's Maria's, it's MO, so you'll know who's done your grading. There are a few papers where you'll see comments in 2 different handwritings, because there's some of the papers that she graded which I also reviewed, and so therefore you might see that there are 2 different sets of handwriting, but that's not true for most of the papers. All right. Now, let me just say a few things about the papers. The first is, most of you did not follow the instructions about what you do when you turn in a paper. 95% of you did not bother to proofread your papers. I mean, there are papers literally where there isn't a single sentence that is a correct specimen of the English language. I'm serious about it. And I'm not saying that's true of all of you, by any stretch of the imagination, but there are papers where if I sat down with a red pen, every sentence has some error of grammar, syntax, that is your structure, diction, vocabulary, spelling. Words such as whether we should go or not, and somebody writes WEATHER, you've got to proofread your papers. You've got to go have a computer spell check done on your papers. First you do a computer spell check, and then you proofread it manually. Because a computer spell check will not distinguish between complementary with an I and complementary with an E, which are 2 completely different words in the English language. Okay? With an E means, with complementary, right? He or she is complementary to this or that. They complement each other. They go along with each other. and he complimented her or she complimented with I, said nice things about that person. Two separate words. So the computer spell check will not do that for you. Okay? You have to do a manual proofreading. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that, when you write a paper, it's like with everything else in life. And I know I'm a writer. Okay? I mean, I know how difficult it is that when you have a blank sheet in front of you to get something on it which is coherent. And it takes a great deal of effort to do it. I understand that. You have to labor over it. But if you don't labor over it, and you just write carelessly, you do violence to the language. There is something called doing violence to the language. And this is by no means the best analogy, but it's like eating burgers. If somebody told me there is no difference at all between a McDonald's burger and a unami burger, a burger is a burger. Okay? So therefore it doesn't matter. I gave you the substance of the argument. It doesn't matter how it was written, that it's impossible to read it, for example, but it does make a difference. And you have to think about the reader. And when you finish writing a paper, read it out. This is a general note, not just with respect to my papers you do for me, for any class that you do. Read it out to yourself. See if it sounds right. The sound is important. There's a little poem. I'll give you an illustration. One of the most extraordinary poems ever written in the English language. It's called The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot. And the first two lines are, in the room the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. Now if I said to you, in the room the women come and go, listen to the O's. The O's are critical. That's the sound of music. The sound of poetry. You cannot assume that just putting things down like that is writing a paper. You have to be much more attentive to your language. Most of you were not graded down, because if I graded you down for grammar and syntax and all of that, we're going to be in serious. We're going to have a serious problem on our hands. Very serious problem. And I'll have a serious problem on my hands. There just a few of you who got graded down because the paper couldn't be read. It was incoherent. But the more substantive thing, because that doesn't concern every one of you, the more substantive thing is, let's take an illustration. Let's say you wrote a paper on development. Now, some of you did, about 15 of you did. About 10 of you wrote on Manto's stories. Okay? And those of you who wrote on Manto's stories, some of you pointed out rightly that what the Manto stories do, which we did not discuss in class because I can't discuss every reading, but there's a reason why that reading has been given to you, that they offer a perspective which is not available through these grand narratives. The grand narratives are the historians and the scholars, all trying to find reasons for the partition, justifying it or not, thinking, well, either the Muslims are guilty, or the Hindus are, or Patel is, or Nehru is, or Gandhi is, or Jinnah, right? That's what the historians and scholars do. What does Manto do? Why does he write a story about the exchange of lunatics? I mean, imagine. Because, of course, one of the things he's doing, he's putting into question the whole rationality of something called a partition. That, in fact, the only sane people possibly were the lunatics. That you've got to start interpreting the stories. Most of you wrote on Manto, what you did was you gave me a description or a summary of the story. That's not going to really suggest why Manto is offering a perspective that is not available. 2 or 3 of those short stories are enough to give you a completely different perspective on the partition. So you have to struggle, endeavor to be a bit more analytical. And lastly, before we hand out the papers, for those of you whose papers are graded by Maria, this evening, sometime between 4 and 6, I'll send you an email to the entire class. I'll let you know what our email is. if your paper was graded by her and you have a problem, or you want to just discuss the paper with her and its shortcomings or strengths, as the case may be, first go to her if your paper has been graded by her. If you are seeking a grade change, which is not very likely, because grades are not negotiable, and I have to tell you right now that if you come to me and if she's graded the paper, be prepared that I might also lower the grade, because I might grade it differently than she might. It does not mean that if you come to me because you got a B minus and you think your grade should go up, it can also go down. Okay? So you have to be prepared for that if you are going to try to negotiate your grade. Grades are not negotiable, but you should, if you feel inclined, discuss your paper with her. And then if you have further questions or you've got a quibble about your grade, then you come to me. And of course, for those of you whose papers are graded by me, you come to me straight away. Okay? All right. We're going to end here, and I'll give you the papers.